Okay, so hello, my Randall Frazier sweater buddies. We're going to be picking up the sleeves on the sweater, and you're going to be doing this while I'm out of the country. So I'm shooting a little video for you to help you. This is obviously a different sweater because, you know, luckily I have like 40 sweaters that are partially finished, and so I can help out with this sort of thing. So the first thing I have to do is I have to take the stitches off the waist yarn, right, or the little holder that I have. And I love these little holders. They're fantastic by Clover, but it does always leave me with my needle sort of at the wrong end if I wanted to just knit them off. So the thing that I find the easiest to do is to grab a needle that is smaller than the needle you're going to be working with. And I always have like a 1 or a 1.5, like a 40 to a 60 inch in my tool supply, so that I can just really easily come into all of those stitches and just grab them and just put them right up on that needle. It's interesting to note that the size of a stitch is not created by the needle that it sits on. It's created by the needle that works the next stitch. So I can put these little guys on any size needle and work off of it and be just fine, with the exception that you don't want to go bigger because then you could stretch those stitches out. Okay, if it's making you nervous to see me slide them off like that, you also can just take one at a time right off of your little holder. If you have waist yarn, you're just going to be pulling the waist yarn out as you're picking up those stitches. And you'll be struggling a little bit about at those ends. And that's one of the reasons I hate waist yarn. But remember that yarn and wool in particular is very stable. So you can just pull it out, find those stitches and put them up on your needle. But I totally get it that sometimes that's a nerve-wracking thing. So just know you can take them one at a time and slide them right on, whichever works for you. Okay, I am going to finish this up. You don't need to watch me do that, and I'll be back in just a sec. One of the questions you may be asking yourself is, don't I need a 16 inch to pick those stitches up with? And the answer is no, you really don't. In fact, what you're just looking for is lots of flexibility. So that really, and not likely to lose your stitches off of this end. So it doesn't really matter what length, but I like a nice long one that I'm not at all worried about. Okay, on this sweater, I happen to know exactly where the center is because this elongated or slipped stitch is the center of my underarm. You're going to be picking up and knitting the number of stitches that the pattern tells you, which for most of us is either 12 or 18 stitches. And you will start with what appears to be the center of the underarm. So if you look at the stitches, and this, yeah, we can see it pretty well. So you could see that little V, right? You can see that little V right there. What we want to do is come in to the top of the stitches, right? And we want to knit at the very, very top of the V. What we don't want to do is go between the V's. See, that's a V and that's a V. And if I come in that little valley below, that's where I get holes. All right. So I'm going to just come right over here. I'm going to find the top of that stitch. I'm going to grab my yarn and just pick up a knit. Going to find my next actual stitch. Come in, grab that yarn, pick up a knit. Find my actual next stitch, grab that yarn and pick up a knit. So for me, I'm going to be just picking up and knitting 3 of those stitches. So to avoid the hole that often happens, we actually have a couple of things that we can do. My favorite on a sweater is to grab this yarn, this strand that lives between those stitches. And I'm going to pick that strand up and I'm going to put it up on the needle. And I'm going to put it up backwards to where the leg that is, the back leg is forward of the front leg, right? The opposite way that it should be sitting on. And I'm going to work this stitch together with the stitch next to it. Because this stitch is on backwards, it's going to twist in the background. And by twisting, that's going to make it smaller. So I'm coming in to, and this is not easy. I'm just going to tell you right now. You can see that this finger is pulling up on the back of that stitch. And I am using a fairly dull needle, coming in and into both of them. okay? And see how that really does a beautiful job of closing up that little gap that exists right there. Okay, so now I'm just gonna knit all the way around to the other side. And as I knit to that other side, when I get there, I'll stop and I'll show you how to do the exact same thing on the other side. I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, for the other side of your sleeve, this is maybe just a smidgy trickier. We're going to go ahead and come to this very last stitch that was live right on my needles. And I'm just going to transfer it tip to tip for the moment. And then I'm going to look for that same sort of bar that tightens everything up when I lift it up. And I'm going to go ahead and put it on my needle. And so when we work in SSK, we often work the SSKs by slipping the first stitch knitwise, the second stitch knitwise, going into both of those stitches and knitting them together. And what that does is it turns them both around and then turns them back around, so neither one of them is twisted. But if instead we were to twist this first stitch, right, and put it on, so it's on the needle where the front one is on backwards, but the bar that you picked up is on correctly. Come into both of those stitches and knit them together through the back loop. That again tightens up that back stitch, but it leaves your front stitch untwisted and you get quite a nice little join. Then you're going to come back in, find your stitches. And I will say that sometimes I just look down here to see where the bottom of my V's are. I'm gonna come in here, grab this guy, find my next V, and find my next V. And then I've picked up for this sweater, oops, do that one more time. There, the 6 stitches that I was meant to pick up. Now I'd place a marker here, and that's my beginning and end of round. But you can see it did a really, really nice tidy job of picking up and not leaving those really big gaping holes that we often get underneath our sleeve. So that's one technique. I'm going to show you the other technique on the other sleeve. This one is the one I use typically on sweaters. The other one I typically use on socks, but both of them could be used sort of interchangeably. So give me a minute, I'll do some adjusting and I'll be back. Okay, so this other technique I use when in my casting on and joining that I left a hole then. And this does happen, obviously, it's right there in my knitting, and it happens to the best of us. And so I do this sort of like 2-stage thing. I'm just gonna come in and go ahead and pick up and knit the way we did before, coming into the top of those stitches. So I'm gonna find those 3 that I want, right? Okay, so now I'm coming up to that hole. So what I really want to do is I want to close the gap, but if I pick it up, right, I make the hole bigger. If I come below, I make the hole bigger. If I come over here, I make the hole bigger. And so I found if I grab a DPN or a cable needle and I go into one leg of the stitch on either side, right? So there and there. See how that pulls those 2 together? So it's underneath this, it's one leg, it's the left leg of the mother stitch below the one that's on the needle, and it's the right leg of, I always think about it as the stitch that's sort of slanting. It's probably one of your raglan stitches. And I pick those 2 stitches up. And I work them together. So that closes that little gap, but I'm still left with this one. So I close that little gap that way. I come over here to this little guy. I do the same thing I did last time, which is I pick this stitch up and I put it up on my needle's backwards, which I didn't do because I'm so used to doing it correctly. So I put it on my needle backwards, right? And then I'm going to, again, lift up on that stitch, come into the stitch next to it, and knit them together. And that closes everything right up for me. I do have an extra stitch, not super worried about that. I can get rid of it on my next round, right? So no big thing. And if I needed to do the same thing, I could do it over here, but I don't have that same horrible gappiness over here. So I'm gonna be good to go. And I just know when I come back and start my decreases, I'm gonna have one extra stitch I'm gonna need to get rid of. So I'd probably work one more round and then just work that decrease as an extra decrease on my next decrease round. And so that's it. So those are my sneaky little things, helpful things to help you not have gaps when you're picking up your stitches. And I hope that's helpful to you. I'm going to show you one more thing. I'm going to go ahead and knit these stitches on. Finish that. I'll show you the other side one more time, and then we'll talk about doing them 2 at a time. Back in a mo. So once again, I'm at this other end, right? So I'm going to slip that last stitch without working it. I'm going to find that stretchy little bar. Get rid of this little thing that's driving me crazy. I'm going to pick up that stretchy little bar, and I'm going to pick it up so that it's on correctly. And then I'm going to put this stitch back on so it's on backwards. And then I'm going to work those 2 stitches together through the back loop, twisting the stitch that's underneath and keeping the stitch that's up on top nice and pretty. And then I'll come in and pick up my last 2 or 3 stitches. And in this case, remember I had that extra stitch on the other side? I can also just pick up 1 fewer here, and actually that's making me pretty happy. So I actually have the right number of stitches underneath. I don't need to make any sort of adjustment. I just picked up 2 here. It's not leaving me any gap, right? It's just sort of working out. Okay, so the other question is, what if I want to knit these 2 sleeves together using magic loop or using 2 circular needles at the same time? So to do that, you need to consider that your sleeves will be knit half front, right, and half back. And you're going to need a needle that's at least 60 inches. So you'll find what is roughly the halfway point of that sleeve, and you will pull out that length of yarn. Now, I've gone ahead and put these back onto these tiny needles, mostly because I'm not actually ready to work these sleeves yet, because this sweater's only, you know, a year without finishing, and I need to at least give it another year to rest. Just gonna tighten that little guy up right there. That stitch is big only because it's my tail. There we go. Okay, so it will look like this, right? You'll have these 2, and then you need to come over here and pick these stitches up the same direction so that they're coming in the same way. Now, because I have these tiny, tiny, tiny little needles, I literally could go into every single stitch and just put them both right on my needle and be able to just do that. If you don't have that same luxury, then you're just going to take another needle, right? Pick them up to the halfway point, slide them onto the other needle, right? Making sure that it makes sort of sense that these 2 fronts would be together and those 2 backs would be together right there. So fronts and backs. And then it'll be coming down. If you've never done magic loop, this is not going to make any sense to you. And I probably am not going to describe magic loop right here on this video, but it gives you an idea of how to get them set up. Then remember, it's at the transition points on each sleeve that you're working your decreases. So give me a second. I'm just going to slide them on and I'll show you sort of what that would look like. Okay, so I've gone ahead and just, they're all on this smaller needle, right? Only because I'm putting it on hold and I need my size 8s for something else. But if I were ready to knit this, I would really be sort of set up right now. Let me see if I can move this camera up just a smidge. And over a little bit. There you go. Okay, so if you see, I've got my big loop on this end, right? And I have both of my needles down here. When you're working magic loop, obviously each sleeve needs to have its own skein of yarn, and your working yarn will always come from the back needle, right? And you will pull it across, you'll pull this back needle out, and you'll work the front needles. And you'll just work up the front of one sleeve, up the front of the next sleeve, down the back of the next sleeve, and down the back of the following one. And you have to work all 1, 2, 3, 4 little segments to complete one full round. So please keep that in mind when you're counting your decreases. If you need actual help with magic loop tutorials, I believe I have that on YouTube as well, and you can take a look at one of those. So hopefully that's helpful to you guys. Thanks. I'll see you in a couple weeks.